This is not a myth. This is true. The world is round. This epigraph is from a film. Columbus, for all we know, did not know what an orange was. He may have had an orange. I'm trying to think if he had an orange or not. Would he have had an orange? If he had an orange, it would be because it was coming up from Morocco, and the Islamic Empire, which was still around at the time, may have provided him with oranges. That's how we get the word orange. Naranja is actually an Arabic word for orange, which comes into Spanish as naranja. Well, there's some other great ones there. So maybe he did have an orange, a naranja, which he's peeling, and then he looks across in the movie. In the movie, he looks out and says, the world is round, damn it, round. No, he says, what did I tell you? It's round like this, round, to his son. So then he goes in, he goes into this meeting with the Salamanca people. But it turns out that if you read page 7, the problem was top of second paragraph of page 7, the idea that the scene is that Columbus figured out that the world was round and all these fools didn't know that the world was flat. If you read second paragraph of second full paragraph of page 7, it says the problem was it was largely fiction. The Salamanca meeting, which occurred either in 1486 or 1487, actually concerned the size of the ocean to the west, with Columbus erroneously arguing that the distance from Spain to Asia was shorter than the authorities claimed. So, just to be clear here, the Portuguese especially, and all educated Europeans knew that the world was round. Columbus told them that it was going to be a short distance to get over to Asia. Give me money, he said, and I will sail west to go east because the world was round. However, Portuguese sailors had already correctly calculated that the world was bigger than Columbus was claiming. They knew the world was round. They knew it was bigger. In fact, Columbus was wrong. What neither of them knew was that there was going to be 2 big continents right there. However, they did know that Columbus was full of it and he would never get to Asia by sailing west because the ocean was too big. He'd run out of food. So he made his mistake. Because Columbus was from Genoa and he was hanging out with the Portuguese and he was trying to get money from them for his voyages, he got very paranoid and very convinced of his own rightness. And so in some ways, he writes his own myth. What's also interesting about this is that we always say that Columbus discovered America, right? Columbus discovered America. And as Restall says, the Portuguese, and to an extent the Spanish, were already sailing west. They had been sailing in these zones of navigation. And if it hadn't been Columbus, it would have been somebody else stumbling out there or navigating out there within 10 years of his landing in 1492. So the Portuguese were trying to find this sea route to Asia. That's what everybody was trying to find because the Islamic Empire, which we'll talk about, was blocking off the trade routes over land. And so they wanted to find this sea route to Asia. It would be faster. And so they were sailing down the coast of Africa, but they were also starting to sail west, leaving off from the Canary Islands and other places. And so they were establishing these westward zones of communication. And so Columbus happened to be one of these people, and he becomes the most famous of them. Well, he becomes famous later. But as Restall says, he actually wasn't as important in terms of somebody else would have done it. And in fact, somebody did do it that we probably haven't heard about, named Pedro Alvarez Cabral on page 9. We don't have a Cabral Day in the United States, but Cabral is known as the first European to actually set foot in what is now Brazil and claim it for Portugal, because Cabral correctly deduced that this was on the side of the line that the Pope had designated that these territories would belong to Portugal. And so Cabral was trying to get to Asia. Look at this voyage. It's crazy. I mean, we've never heard about this, but it's actually much more interesting than Columbus. He leaves Lisbon, comes west, and he knew what he was doing. He was actually going to sail west in order to slingshot over to the east, which he successfully did. But in the meantime, he stops down here and finds that there's a lot of land here. And so he makes his way along the coastline. He puts up a cross. He claims the whole territory for Portugal. He also correctly deduces that this is not just an island, but a continent. He found a whole big landmass here. But there was nothing to do there, because what they really wanted to do is get over to India. So he cruises around Africa, heads up here, lands in India, and then eventually makes his way back. So I say this to in part, again, this myth that Columbus was somehow more brilliant than anyone else, or that he actually knew where he was, is mistaken. When Columbus landed in the islands of the Caribbean, he believed, well, I want to talk about why we have names for people, which came up in the film we watched on Tuesday, both in Spanish, indios, and in English, Indians. The inhabitants of the Americas were called by the Spaniards and others indios or Indians. Why did Columbus name the people he found indios? He thought he was in India. He thought he'd made it to some islands off the coast of India. And it's not just that he thought he was in India, he really wanted to believe that he was in India, because that's what he was selling. So he sailed back and he was like, I'm there, and these are Indians, indios. And so he was basically lying. Well, I don't know if he was lying, maybe that's what he believed, for a number of years, until somebody else made it around the coast of Africa and made it to actually India and came back and said no. And so then he actually got arrested, stripped of his titles for lying about where he was. So yes, but the name is stuck. And it comes out, for those of you in childhood education, it comes out in textbooks sometimes, that the first inhabitants of the Americas, they sometimes call them Paleo-Indians, which really bugs me. It's somehow stuck in archaeology. It's like Stone Age Indians, but again, they have nothing to do with the South Asian continent. So we've learned not to call people Indians. So in my son's elementary school textbook, he instead was taught to call them the first Americans. First Americans. Like that better? To me, it's kind of weird, because it implies that somebody's sort of running across with a big American flag, right? I mean, yes, they were the first in the Americans. I mean, we're also taught to say Native Americans, which again, better than Indians for sure. But it's sort of ironic, because when people call themselves first Americans or Native Americans, you're basically using a term from Amerigo Vespucci, who was another Italian explorer who wrote a very more famous book and was a colleague of Columbus and was like exploring the coast of Brazil again. And so that's why the Americans got named. And so the people who were living in the Americas really would never have taken this name upon themselves. And in fact, on page 10, it says that Columbus did not live to see America named. So he didn't even last long enough before the name got put on it as Native Americans. In some parts of Canada and other places, the people there have taken on the name. They call themselves maybe the First Nations, not the first Americans, but the First Nations, the first people, or First Peoples. Because nation has this kind of implication, as we'll talk about, that you're living in a nation state. I think in some ways, what has perhaps is the most correct, or the most correct for people to say who are not indigenous or not native, because there are some people who are, I will say that there are some people who are indigenous who have appropriated the name Indian as a political move. And there are reasons for that. But for people who are not indigenous, we are, I think, settling that it's, if you do not know the group affiliation, to use indigenous or native and to usually capitalize it. And so some of the rules and ideas about capitalization has changed since Restall wrote his book. He tends to capitalize things like the Conquest and Conquistador, which is kind of weird, and leave uncapitalized things like native or indigenous, but we're starting to kind of reverse that these days, which is for the best. So I want to talk, because in anthropology, we would usually talk more about the indigenous peoples and how people got to the Americas. I want to briefly talk about something that we go over in Intro to Anthropology. I'm drawing on a recent book that's very interesting by Jennifer Raff, which deals with some of the genetics and the archaeological evidence for why people, or how people got into the Americas, and has kind of proved some things that we thought about for a while. I guess I won't say proved, but has offered evidence that basically the people who are indigenous to, or who were the first peoples in the Americas at about around 15,000 years ago, maybe a little bit earlier, were basically from what is now Siberia, spent a decent amount of time on a land area called Beringia, which is up here. There's still some places named for it, but a lot of it is now submerged by water. The coastal area levels have risen. And so a lot of the archaeological evidence for these dispersals has been lost or disappeared. And what it seems to suggest is that for the most part, it was a coastal route along the coast, people coming down, and then here in Panama splitting up and going down this side of the coast and going down this side of the coast. So that this was you're able to move in boats and on water much quicker than over land. And so if people moved this way down the coast, they could then disperse inland faster and easier. And it seems to equate for one of the reasons why we see archaeological evidence almost, it seems to appear everywhere around the same time, around 15,000 years ago. So again, we have sometimes these ideas that the first peoples were these big game hunters chasing mammoths across the ice. And there was probably some of that, but what really seems to be the big dispersal is via a coastal route through the Americas. Just a few things about the people who were indigenous here. They were not aliens. They did not come from other planets. There's no evidence that the heads on Easter Island were brought here from any other place. The Maya pyramids were not given to us by people from outer space. Also, they were not Europeans. A lot of people like to talk about some dudes from France or something crossing over the ice. No, they were not Europeans. They were not the Egyptians, and they were not a lost tribe of Israel. All these things were posited or crazy ideas at one point. And it's also before what is called the Clovis first hypothesis, which is the idea, it stems from the idea from Clovis, New Mexico. There were some very telltale spear points. And so people, again, thought about big game hunting, that those were the first technologies. It now seems that the Clovis hunting technologies were actually developed in the Americas. And there were already people here before that. And finally, as I said, that the coastal routes are more important than the land routes. So we'll be, over the next decades, this will be revisited and some of these dates will be revised. But I think we're starting to coalesce around a better explanation for why people are in the Americas when Columbus and Cabral show up. Interestingly, as Restall notes, Columbus, because he wasn't seen as a hugely important person here in the Portuguese and Spanish expansion, he actually becomes relatively forgotten for a few centuries. And it's not that nobody knew who he was, it's just outside of probably some historical circles, it wasn't a big deal. In fact, as Restall says, the person who becomes more associated with the conquest, especially in Latin America, was Hernan Cortés in Mexico, and associated with the downfall of the Aztec Empire, and Francisco Pizarro, who we saw in the film yesterday, associated with the downfall of the Inca Empire. So these two figures, especially perhaps Cortés, become the icons of the conquest. Now you might wonder then, what the heck then? Why don't we know about Cortés? Anybody know about Cortés before this class, or Pizarro? You've heard of Columbus. How did that happen? He was forgotten. Well, it turns out that the Columbus Day, or the Columbus Day celebrations, the idea of that we should celebrate the landing of Columbus in Hispaniola, what he named Hispaniola, what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, actually began a lot later, 1792, so 300 years after the landing, and especially in 1892. Who did this? Anybody remember? Who really loves Columbus? Who would be doing a Columbus Day parade? Who are the people that get the angriest when you try to say Columbus wasn't that big a deal? No? Does anybody get angry? Basically, the re-celebration of Columbus happened because of an alliance there was heavy Irish and Italian, actually especially Irish, even more than Italian, immigration into the United States. The United States was very suspicious of Catholic people. We didn't get a Catholic president until John F. Kennedy. And even then, people are like, oh, he might be more loyal to the Pope than he is to the country. Because people were very suspicious of we think of ourselves as a Protestant country, right? And so in the United States, the Irish and the Italian immigrants, because they were Catholic, were looked at with suspicion. And so they seized upon Columbus as this icon of somebody who you could be good, and you could be a good citizen and be a national person. And they started to have parades and started to have these huge celebrations. And so it's odd today because, the people who sometimes get the angriest about Columbus Day and still want to do it are like the Irish. And you're like, what? Why? And it's because this gave them a route to citizenship. And to be honest, a claim on whiteness, because the Irish were kind of down there and we were thinking that they weren't, they were very, very denigrated by the Brits, and in the Anglo-Saxon world, the Irish were seen as not up to it, as well as the Italians. And so this was a great alliance. The other thing that happened is that Spain was sort of down on its luck. It had this huge empire. And then all the countries became independent, and you know, by 1892, they needed something to kind of throw a big celebration, get their morale back up, because they seemed like they were down on their luck. So Columbus Day, the whole celebration of Columbus as a hero, is a relatively recent phenomenon. It really got started in the last 150 years or so as a big deal. For a couple hundred years, nobody really cared about whether Columbus was there or not. So instead, we had Hernan Cortés, who was really a kind of person who was seen as the true brilliant conqueror, as Restall put it, an icon of the conquest. So part of this chapter, of course, is about Columbus and about the idea that Columbus was particularly brilliant or exceptional, and trying to bust that myth. But most of this chapter is about Cortés and other great exceptional handful of men types, and to what degree they were individually brilliant in the overthrow of the empires that they were able to overthrow. Restall goes through what he calls the conquest procedure. I'm going to go through all 7 steps of this conquest procedure. But Liam, what is the point of saying that Cortés was following the conquest procedure? Where did Cortés learn this stuff? Or where was he getting these ideas? Did they all come from his head? I thought you wrote about this, Liam, but I might be mistaken. Yeah, I know. I'm cruel that way. Did all these things come from Cortés's head? Was he just a brilliant guy who knew how to do all this stuff? He knew how to do it more than others. Yeah, he was, he had his ways, but Restall is very determined to tell us, or tells us, that what Cortés was doing was following what he calls conquest procedures that had Iberian roots predating the conquest and were consolidated during the Caribbean phase of conquest. So what he's trying to do here is tell us that when we celebrate Cortés as this brilliant conqueror, we have to realize that he was simply following a design or a plan that had already been a roadmap, you might say, which they had learned before. And so I want to talk about where they got the ideas that they did before we go through the 7 conquest procedure steps, where the ideas came from that they would carry out and sort of be able to do in the Caribbean. As he said, as Restall says, it has Iberian roots. Oh, that's a strange word. Iberia. Yeah. What do we know about what is Iberia? Yes, David. Yeah, the Iberian Peninsula is what is now Spain and Portugal. So the countries, what now comprises Spain and Portugal. So what does he mean by it had Iberian roots? Well, here, let's take a look at a map. In order to understand what was going on, we first have to talk about, and that's why I got all excited about the word naranja, orange, which comes into Spanish from Islam. There are other words. Are there any Spanish speakers here? A little bit. Oh, it's sad. Okay. There's a number of words in Spanish which are very curious. Azúcar, which is the word for sugar. That's where we get our word for sugar. Again, from Arabic. Ojalá. Literally, may Allah grant that, right? I mean, what is this word doing in Spanish? Hamas, never. Again, what the heck? This has to do with the fact that the Islamic Empire was the coolest and most advanced and one of the best places to be during this period of 800 years, rapidly spread after the death of Prophet Muhammad. It had some of the best Greek texts. It had some of the best universities. It gave us Arabic numerals, which you've ever tried to do division in Roman numerals, you know it sucks. If we wouldn't have had Arabic numerals, there'd be no calculus, there'd be nothing, not even algebra. So they gave us a bunch of stuff, and sugar producing technologies, all those words, naranja, all those things. But the thing is Islam, they got stopped here in the Pyrenees, but they were basically ruling the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal, for hundreds of years. They were the bosses of that. And, you know, there's all sorts of architecture and stuff that you can look at to see, you know, what had happened there. And so for hundreds of years, these places have been coexisting. And gradually, the people, they started to push back and push the Islamic Empire back in what was later called the Reconquista, the Reconquest. And so if you look at the Iberian Peninsula, there it is. Thank you, David. The Iberian Peninsula in 1492, what is now, again, Portugal, Spain, and maybe we could say a little bit of France up here, right? This was the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. All of Portugal had been, was now basically a kingdom that was not under Islamic rule anymore. It was in some ways perhaps one of the first nations, you might say, and that's why the Portuguese were trying to go west and develop their own empire. I mean, just as a side note, it is crazy to think that the Portuguese Empire was one of this tiny, tiny, tiny little place in Europe was dominated most of the world for 100 years or so. That's where we get Brazil and all different parts of Asia and India, out to Macau and all sorts of places. And then also the people who would later call themselves Spaniards started to do the same thing. At the time, I don't even think they would have called themselves Spaniards. They were mostly from the Kingdom of Castile and from the Kingdom of Aragon. And they were sort of slowly pushing back on the Islamic Empire. And in 1492, Columbus is off doing his thing and landing in, he didn't know where, in the Caribbean, which he called the West Indies, of course. But if you were living in this place, the most important event in 1492 would have been the fall of the Kingdom of Granada, which was the last Muslim caliphate in what is now Spain. The Muslims were expelled. It was also the year that the Spanish expelled the Jews and began the Spanish Inquisition, which was basically convert to Christianity or die. So until that time, Europe had been a bit more, how to say, tolerant of other religions, and had actually been intermixed with Islamic and with Jewish elements. And at that point, Spain decided that it was going to be a Christian place. And so what I'm trying to get at here, and what I think Russell is talking about, is the roots of conquest and how you conquer things go back to this experience on the Iberian Peninsula. And so as these people started to sail west and bring this stuff into the Americas, they already had these ideas of what they were supposed to do and what you did with people who thought and looked different than you. I also want to mention something about language in Spain, because again, I said these people were from the Kingdom of Castile. And if you travel in Latin America, a lot of times, and you know, if you ask somebody if they habla español, if they speak Spanish, they'll say, oh, I habla castellano, which is speak Castilian. And you're like, what the hell are you talking about? Well, they're talking about that they speak Castilian Spanish. Because if you go to Spain now, hey, has anybody been to Spain? Ah, okay. If you go to Spain now, there's parts of it that speak Spanish, and there's several different kind of dialects of Spanish, but there's also people who speak Catalan, which extends up into France, and there's people who speak a Basque language, and there's people who speak Galician. And so, in fact, Spain is not even today as linguistically unified under Spanish as certain places are in Latin America. All right, the conquest procedures. So what Restall outlines that there were sort of 7 steps, and these that don't necessarily occur in this order, but there were 7 measures, 7 things that Cortés and other conquistadors were following. The first one was to take some sort of legal measure, to read out a document, put up a cross, say that this is a town, to sort of try to call into effect the legality of what you were doing, which was closely connected to making an appeal to the king. And if you read this stuff carefully, these conquistadors are always backstabbing each other, sailing across the ocean, trying to get the king to recognize them, to give them the authority, to give them the stuff. And so what Cortés was doing when he burned those ships or tried to scuttle the ships and keep people away was to keep people from sailing off and making their own appeal to the king and backstabbing him. So this is often seen as like this amazing, brilliant thing that Cortés did. But as Restall says, this was what everybody was doing. They were all trying to get this legal authority so that they would become the true conquerors of the Americas. So those are the first things. You need the legal authority. And it's interesting here because, you know, you often think about those conquistadors going in and simply establishing military rule. They did not. They first needed some sort of legal justification. That's why they're always reading the Bible out to people and saying, convert or we will do something bad to you. They needed the sanction of the king. The third thing Restall mentions is that they wanted gold and silver. Now, Restall is saying there's a myth here, a sort of sub-myth, you might say, that the Spaniards were only interested in gold and silver, and that was all they had. They were sort of so thirsty for it that that was all they could think about. And what he says is it wasn't that they just like shiny things. It was that gold and silver were the only currency that existed. And if they could get gold and silver, then they could pay people and keep the expeditions going. If not, people would just abandon them. So they needed gold and silver to keep the conquest going. As he says on page 23, it's the gold and silver from the Americas, and its pursuit by Spaniards underwrote the conquest, so it subsidized the conquest, and virtually all subsequent economic activity in the New World, let alone altering the economic and political history of Europe. By the way, that's a precursor to the next book we'll be reading about Potosi and the silver mines, because in fact, yes, the silver that was discovered in the Americas alters the political and economic history of Europe and the rest of the world as well. But they're looking for this gold and silver, again, not because it's gold and silver of itself, not because they're fascinated with jewelry, but because they wanted it to pay people off and because it would justify them getting political rule over the people there. Which brings us to our fourth point, which is getting native populations. We sometimes have an image that the conquistadors were killing everybody. In fact, they did not want to kill everybody. They did want to kill certain people, don't get me wrong. They didn't want to kill everybody because it was very important. They needed people to labor for them, to produce things, to get this gold and silver, to give them food. And so they wanted to get native populations on their side or subdue them. So they were not actually interested. They were interested in ruling people for sure, but they did not want to carry out some sort of getting rid of people wholesale, because then they'd be stuck. And they were also often looking for, this fifth point, is they were looking for an interpreter. Someone who could go between people they were trying to subdue or conquer and who spoke hopefully multiple indigenous languages. And there are some very famous interpreters who come up here. And one of the points that Restall is making is that it wasn't just the individual brilliance of Cortés to get, we'll read about one of the famous interpreters in Mexico, to get these interpreters. That was something that you were always looking for, somebody who could make sense of what was going on. The thing about these interpreters is there was often a very gendered aspect to the interpreters and the way in which the native populations were subdued. And actually, that's why I'm glad we watched the film yesterday, because we had some key parts from a Peruvian historian named Maria Rostworowski, who during the film was about 90 years old, is now passed away at the age of 100, but wow, good run there, I think. But the reason I liked her commentary is that she was one of the few people who was talking about this gender difference and the fact that Pizarro, when he got there, one of the indigenous groups, he was 52 years old and unmarried, and so they baptized a young, well, let's be serious, it was a teenage girl. They baptized her and they gave him to her as his concubine. And so when she got in trouble during the siege of Lima, she's the one who sent word to her mother to send in an army, right? That's the whole point of that film yesterday, is that the people who rescued Pizarro were an indigenous army coming in to wipe out the people who were laying siege to Pizarro. In the afterword to this book, when he revisits this book 20 years later, Restall acknowledges that he should have paid more attention to the gendered aspects of the conquest. That the Spanish, the conquistadors, they would deliberately go in, and the best interpreters they could find also often happened to be just blunt about it, teenage girl sex slaves. And it was a trade in enslaved women, which they carried out throughout the Americas. And Restall says, I should have paid more attention to the gendered aspects of conquest and how this was going down in terms of these old male conquistadores and the interpreters that they got as, and basically forced into sex and interpretation. Let's put it that way. So, sixth procedure. What was the sixth thing they did, Marcus? What's the thing that conquistadors love to do when they come into town? Well, what did they do? You don't have to, it was contained in your comment, actually. You don't have to know that it's number 6. What were they doing? A lot of murder. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Restall calls this, what he calls it is display violence or theatrical violence. And again, in the afterword, he says he should have probably made it more spelled out that by display or theater, he doesn't mean that it's just a play. It means that you're terrorizing a population. So again, the Spaniards were not out to kill everybody because that would be counterproductive. They wanted to get everybody under their thumb. But in order to do that, they'd go into some place and just, take a village by surprise and just massacre everybody. Or massacre all the men and enslave all the women. Kill the men in front of their wives and take the women. That was just what you did, or what they did, in order to strike terror into the heart of the population, to break their will to fight back. Again, they didn't want to get everybody, but they wanted to make sure you knew what was going on. It wasn't necessarily that they had absolute military superiority. It was just they loved to do this surprise attack and torture people and just really, really take it out on people who were least able to fight back. So they did the terrorizing violence thing, and they also would capture the leader. Again, as Restall notes, this was not something that was some brilliant tactical move. This is just what they always did. It's like, all right, who's the leader? Let's get him, and let's take him hostage and hopefully torture him, and make sure we call in or ransom for him. As we saw in the film, you capture Atahualpa, the Inca leader, demand a huge ransom in gold. They pay out the ransom, you melt the gold down, and then you kill him. So this was standard procedure. Again, what Restall is trying to say here is that this idea that it was only a few people doing this brilliant thing is mistaken because of what they had learned before during the Reconquista and what had come on before. So that's chapter 1. We spent most of our time on chapter 1. We should probably talk about chapter 2 and 3, but we'll hopefully go a bit faster with these. Myth number 2. Neither paid nor forced. The myth of the king's army. Actually, this is a very important point. Basically, the point is that we've rewritten or rethink this history as if this was an army in the modern sense, subduing, and I've even done it in my last little rant, that this was a military operation. The conquistadors were not, as they said in the film, he was very clear, they were ruthless, but they were not soldiers. They were not soldiers in any sort of modern sense of the word, probably not even soldiers in the sense that was happening in the 16th century. So as Restall said, the idea that Spain was even a nation, I mean, like I said, even today, it's not necessarily linguistically unified. So again, you have this kingdom of Castile expanding, allying with the kingdom of Aragon. And so it was starting to think of itself as a nation. But the idea that there was an army or a military, that would actually come later. Most of the people who were conquistadors, or many of them, were illiterate. They were basically from peasant stock. In Spain, they were, maybe artisans. Well, let's see. Megan, who were these folks? Who was doing this stuff? Yeah, they'd sort of gone to seek their fortune. And so they would often find themselves seeking patronage, what we call patronage, like somebody to sponsor them. I mean, Columbus was actually a person like that. He was seeking somebody to sponsor him so that he could get the money to do what they said. Restall calls them armed entrepreneurs. So yes, they were ruthless. They had swords. They had guns, old-fashioned guns, but they weren't soldiers. And so the way that the conquest worked, it wasn't like there was a king sending soldiers into battle. What Restall says, it was a chain of conquest. So you'd conquer one place, and then somebody would say, hey, I want to go. I mean, that's how Hernan Cortés got to Mexico. He was in Cuba, and the governor of Cuba said, go in and conquer the mainland. So as soon as Cortés gets to the mainland, he claims it all for himself, sends somebody back to Spain to say, I'm the new guy here. So basically it was what Restall calls a relay system of conquest. You take over one place, and then again, this patronage system gets into place where, somebody would ask for the money to set up a new venture. And again, in the afterword, Restall goes even further than this. He says that, it's not even that they didn't even have military experience in the sense of what soldiers are supposed to do. Let's put it this way. If you are a soldier in an army and you are not at war, what are you supposed to do? Yes. Train. Yeah. If I was a soldier and I came in here in my reserve uniform, right? Let's say I'm a reservist. Can I kill you? No. Right. You're not supposed to kill anybody. And even if you were at war, let us say we've gone to war and we're soldiers, who am I supposed to be killing? The enemy, the combatants, right? The other soldiers. What am I not supposed to be doing? Which is what the Spaniards, I'm going to call them Spaniards, were always doing, which is going in and killing people who are unarmed and just, surprise attack. That's not a soldier thing to do, right? That's just trying to instill fear and terrorism in the enemy, right? We've actually come up with rules. There's like guidelines for how you go to war, how you treat prisoners. You're not supposed to torture them. This day, you just like go for it, man. That was their standard MO. Yes. So, yeah, Restall talks about that a little bit as the Spanish Empire develops, right? Then you have the military in Spain, and it starts to you have the Napoleonic War, like as the 15th century develops, and then they do need a military. And later on in the Conquest, they also need a military. But during the Conquest, it was just basically people going out and doing their thing. In part because of myth number 3A, the myth of the white conquistador. So I'm going to break this myth into two parts. So in part, you have this idea that they were all white, but Kaylee, what were they? Who else is there? The Native Americans, the Native allies. Now, I think I said this and it certainly comes up in the film, this is perhaps the most important factor in terms of how the initial conquest went down. When you had 100 and 150 Spaniards or whatever, having the indigenous people who were allied with you doing the fighting was extremely important. And they may have actually constituted more like what we would call an army. Now, as you saw in the film, these people are, of course, completely left out of the conquistador accounts because you don't want to tell anybody about all the people who were helping you, because then you might have to pay them, or you might have to make good on your promises, or they simply appear like kind of as a side note to the historical record. If people talk about them, they often see them as this thing that they were forced to do this, instead of thinking that maybe the indigenous people had their own interests in mind as they were doing this. And so this is something that I don't think we will perhaps ever know exactly what kinds of ideas and strategies, because they don't show up in the documents as much. There's a few hints of it. But in order to figure this out, one of the things we have to realize is that there were two huge empires in the Americas when the Europeans set up. One in what is now Mexico, the Aztec Empire. One was now Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Bolivia, the Inca Empire, which were huge, enormous empires, incredible feats, architecture, and all kinds of things that they were able to do. But in both cases, they had risen to power quite rapidly. And so they were both in some ways known for their cruelty to their subjugated populations, and they hadn't incorporated the populations under them, under their rule. And so in both cases, they were vulnerable to other people coming in and disrupting this alliance. So, as Restall puts it, the Aztecs, for example, who are known for being particularly brutal to conquered peoples, they got a perhaps exaggerated but not entirely unfair reputation for human sacrifice and stuff like that. So people were mad at them, and they allied with Hernán Cortés in order to drive them out. And when, as we saw in the film, when Pizarro comes into the Andean region, into the South American Andean region, the Inca were actually involved in a North-South fraternal civil war. And so he was able basically to play them off each other and put himself into the conflict. So this is, again, like I said, perhaps the hugest factor of the conquest. To complete our chapter on the myth of the white conquistador, we also would want to talk about how people from Africa were part of every voyage into the Americas and every conquest expedition. Of course, they were often doing help or auxiliary roles, but there were sometimes people who were leading and themselves Black conquistadors. Juan Valiente, example, and Juan Garrido is another example that Restall discusses, who are in their own sense become leaders of expeditions. Now, I think this is a really important point to include, because a lot of this has been wiped out of the history. But we don't want to then sort of create this new exceptional man history that is now like, oh, great, we have a Black conquistador, because in fact, this was not a wonderful time to be subduing and enslaving others. But it's simply worth recognizing for the complexity that this brings to the picture. All right. Before we start watching the mission part 1, I want to talk about the so what of all this. Why do I bother to get so animated about what the Spaniards were doing, whether they were soldiers or not? Does it matter? Does it matter what we call people? And I guess, at least for me, I'll hope to convince you that, for one thing, the part of this is just trying to understand historically that here we have this huge development in world history. Up until this time, human evolution, for example, is centered in Africa, and that's sort of the center of world history for a while. And then with agriculture and the rise of various kingdoms, we could say that the population and the world history shifts into Asia and to China. And then you have this weird time where a tiny place, Portugal, and a tiny place, Spain, are basically come to be world powers and take us into a phase of history known as, I guess, European expansion, or the rise of the West. And so to understand what happened during this conquest or this encounter is extremely important, how we understand the history of what has happened in the last 500 years. And it could be that history is shifting back into Asia, and this will be just a blip in human history, but it's certainly been a pretty important blip, at least so far. And the question then, of course, centers on, well, who made this history? Is history made by a few exceptional great men who were brilliant and able to do things that nobody else could, see things, realize that an orange and an earth was the same? Or were there historical processes at work? People who contributed to these things and people who played a role, but were not necessarily shaping everyone's destiny. And of course, the question of how we treat other people. When you encounter someone who looks and thinks and acts differently than you do, what should you do? How should we behave? And so I think that our template or ideas about how people treat each other, what people are after, what the world should and could be like, is starting to be formed during this period. And so there were a few lessons from this so far that I think we can already gather, is that people who have been previously left out of the story, Black conquistadors, Africans being present on every voyage, the native populations who had their own ideas about why they might want to ally with the new folks. All of these people were actually very important to how the process played out. And it was a lot more complicated, complex than it's been typically told to us. There were a lot of things going on. We can't recapture all of those things, and probably we don't want to relive them all, but it was, at least we would understand that it was complicated and that it wasn't destined to be. Things could have gone differently. Things could have gone either way, you might say. And so it's not like this was given to us already by God or by germs or by technology or by some superior intelligence. There were lots of things going on, and there were a lot of things that happened that could have been different. A lot of things that happened that we don't even know happened. And if that is true historically, this epic that we've been trying to understand, then it means that also our future, what is to be, is not set in stone. It's not given to us. We're not destined to succeed or fail. We have to pay attention to the complexity of the world and the diversity of the world out there in order to figure out what kind of world we hope to make.